Hi, welcome to the session, everyone, which seeks to unpack the topic of whether New Zealand needs a stewardship code. My name is Erica Miles, and I'm an independent consultant specialising in responsible investment and sustainable finance. But before we commence this session, I would like to acknowledge the FSC and the key sponsors of this conference. This discussion has only been made possible thanks to their generous support. I'd especially like to highlight Trust Executors, who are the Platinum sponsor, and they also happen to be a key driving force behind a code in New Zealand. And the thanks also goes to Westpac New Zealand, who are the session sponsor. We have a lot of great content today and 4 terrific speakers, so please do make the most of having this talented bunch together by asking them lots of questions. I would encourage you to take this opportunity using the Q&A function or the chat function. Don't be shy, and please do ask questions throughout the session. I've been told that we need to expect at least 5 questions. And as always, there is no such thing as a silly question, so please don't be shy. We have an amazing bunch of people and talking all about things stewardship, so do take the opportunity to ask the panellists any questions that you may have. And just a final note before we head into the session, please note the views of our speakers today are their own personal views and not the views of the organisations they represent. So as I mentioned earlier, the session is unpacking the question of whether New Zealand needs a stewardship code. I'm not going to pronounce the Latin in front of the title, but I can confirm that when translated, it means who's watching the watchers, which is all about accountability, and it frames this debate aptly. By way of a background, the idea of a stewardship code came from the Sustainable Finance Roadmap, which was published in November of last year. It was a key recommendation applying to the investment community, and in the workshops that we had to develop the roadmap. The idea of a code was considered a no-brainer. But now, with the rubber hitting the road, do we actually need one? To get us started, we will cover what we mean by stewardship, what a code is and what it does, and we'll have a look at unpacking the factors that we need to collectively consider when developing and implementing a code for New Zealand. So before we do that, I'd just like to introduce our talented speakers. We're extremely fortunate to have such a high calibre of speakers today, many of whom have extensive experience in developing and implementing stewardship codes internationally, and indeed on advising clients on effective stewardship practices. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to them. The first one is Philip. He's the Head of Investment Solutions at BT Fund Management and was recently appointed as a board member to the CFA Society in New Zealand. Philip has previously held senior investment roles at Mercer, ING and AMP Asset Management in London. Welcome, Philip. Bruce is the chair of Who's Good, which is an ESG evaluation company in Korea. He also consults to investors on Stewardship Code implementation and was a founding member of the Korean Stewardship Code Committee. He's also a member of the CFA Standard of Practice Council and the Capital Market Policy Council. Welcome, Bruce. Jenny is the barrister and solicitor specialising in commercial litigation with a focus on financial services and company and securities law. She's the president of Lawyers for Climate Action New Zealand. And finally, and certainly but not least, is Susheela. She also advises investors on responsible investment with a special focus on stewardship. Susheela has been instrumental in developing stewardship in Australia and globally, and she also advises the UNPRI on leading stewardship practice. And when she isn't busy with all of that, Susheela is also the chair of the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia. So I'm truly grateful to have such a high calibre of speakers help with this session today. And just to recap, please do put your Q&A through the chat function or put it on through the Q&A function on the Zoom session. So let's start off with you, Susheela. Stewardship and active ownership can mean different things to different people. So when we're talking stewardship, What exactly are we meaning here?
Thanks, Erica. It's a great question. And of course, in common parlance, stewardship is talking about the way that somebody exercises responsibility for something. In the context of financial services, stewardship, as far as I have encountered it, has gone back to around 2001 at the time of Regnan, and of course lots of others were doing it prior to that. A really instrumental piece in the history in Australia was the collapse of a big insurer, HIH. There was a royal commission into the collapse of this listed company, which was a systemically important insurer in the Australian economy. As a result of it going under, there were a whole lot of things that couldn't happen anymore. Whole construction companies going bankrupt because they couldn't get insurance and so on. And one of the quotes that came out of that royal commission from Justice Neville Owen says, "If shareholders as owners are unwilling or unable to make their views known to management, then management will lack all guidance and constraint from those whose interests they are supposed to be serving." So stewardship in this context was very much focused on being the holder of assets, companies essentially, that go out and do things in the market, but whose leaders need to be watched, themselves to be watched. So the directors are watching the companies and the investors need to be watching and guiding the directors' oversight in their interests. Stewardship came to be very focused, therefore, on the kinds of actions that those standing in the position of owners need to be sort of exercising. And so the reason it's become so important within the financial sector is that in reality, what we have is a chain of intermediation between the beneficial owners of a company, which might be somebody who owns it in shares of a company or has exposure to the shares of the company, for instance, through a KiwiSaver at one end, and then the companies at the other end, and a whole lot of intermediaries in the middle. And as a result, it was kind of getting lost as to who's responsible for providing that guidance and constraint. Stewardship in the context of financial services is all about making sure that the people in the middle of that chain, typically asset managers, are taking up that responsibility along with the rights.
Yeah, you mentioned the responsibility one, Susheela, which is a really important point, and one that could be construed as being part of an investor's fiduciary duty. But Bruce, where exactly does a stewardship code fit into this puzzle?
Well, I think stewardship code becomes an aspirational fiduciary duty for sustainable growth. In fact, fiduciary duty is not a static concept. Rather, it is continuously evolving one along with the market practice and financial theories. So originally, fiduciary duty was called duty of care or duty of loyalty, and later on, it was called prudent man rule. Nowadays, fiduciary duty expands to stewardship code. The other point I would like to make here is that fund managers, people who manage other people's money, and the CEOs of listed companies, they are sharing same responsibility for the society and economy. For listed firms, we have corporate governance code. New Zealand has New Zealand corporate governance code, which most of the listed firms have signed up already. While the fund managers, we have fiduciary stewardship code to achieve sustainable growth. Because of this, it is better to think of stewardship code as a mirror to New Zealand corporate governance code, meaning fund managers, asset owners are watching, monitoring, and engaging listed firms, whether they do stick to corporate governance code or not. So stewardship code is designed to be designed to preclude any short-termism, short-term decision-making, or conflict of interest, or inefficiency. via improving corporate governance. They use generally engagement and proxy voting as major tool for Stewardship Code.
I like the analogy there, Bruce, that Stewardship Code is best considered a mirror to the corporate governance code, and the aspiration of sustainable growth being the intent of a code. But what at a practical level would a code for New Zealand seek to achieve?
So practically, Stewardship Code try to enhance long-term sustainability of New Zealand by improving capital efficacy. I mean, listed companies in any country are the best companies in that country, meaning that if the listed company's capital efficacy improves, the country's economic growth sustainability will improve. The other thing is Stewardship Code is still focusing on corporate governance, along with integration of ESG factors. But here, this is why engagement and proxy voting is the basic tool of this aspirational code.
Yeah, the voting and engagement, Bruce, can be sort of considered the sort of basics of stewardship. But what, in your experience, are some of the other core elements of a typical stewardship code that's beyond engagement and voting?
On top of these two, Stewardship Code try to establish stewardship policies by asset managers and how they're going to disclose it. Secondly, they also include policies to minimize conflict of interest of stakeholders. And thirdly, how they're going to report it to their beneficiaries regarding their stewardship responsibility. And finally, this is the latest development in UK and Japan Stewardship Code, but these two revised Stewardship Code are expanding to include ESG factors in Stewardship Code policy and also service providers' responsibilities, such as proxy voting advisors or ESG evaluation firm.
If I understand you correctly, Bruce, the codes overseas have a requirement for stewardship policy, the conflict of interest, particularly for the voting voting, and then the requirement for reporting and improved transparency.
That's right.
The integration of ESG and the considering of the value chain, which leads me nicely into the next question, actually, Philip. So locally, we know we need to improve stewardship here, but I'd like to understand why we did actually need to change the status quo that we have at the moment. And was wondering if you would be able to unpack what you see as being the key issues that would need to be addressed through a stewardship code in New Zealand.
Yeah, so sure. The context is that there has been a maturing of responsible investment approaches in New Zealand. And while the biggest focus of the industry for some time has been on negative screening, more recently there has been an increasing focus on ESG integration and stewardship activities, and that's you sort of see that evidenced firstly for fund managers. The Responsible Investment Association's benchmark report for New Zealand this year, corporate engagement and shareholder action were the third most widely used responsible investment approach, with the report noting that active ownership practices continue to mature with more active, considered and targeted use of corporate engagement and shareholder action. So, and then for asset owners, just referring to another Source Mercer's annual survey of endowments and foundations, half of the respondents said they had corporate governance and proxy voting policies in place, and another quarter of those funds are considering implementing them. However, in the RIA report, stewardship was the area which showed the biggest difference between the leaders and non-leaders. And another point is that, while most fund managers and asset owners have got a set of investment beliefs and a responsible investment policy now, they don't always have a stewardship policy. And even fewer have got a set of voting principles, for example. So, thirdly, corporate engagement has in the past been more narrowly centred on the G, so the governance, although it's fair to say that environmental and social topics are growing, in particular around climate and since COVID. So, I believe that a code would help and guide the existing practices, but also importantly would help in terms of bringing along, those asset owners and fund managers who are looking to catch up. And I think, it could do this in a few different ways, but for example, by improving the effectiveness and transparency of corporate engagement. So a lot of the corporate engagement is done by fund managers in private, meeting with the board or management. Now this, can be very constructive and effective, but clearly it's not as transparent. So, some issues might make more progress, if they were given a public hearing, such as the level of diversity in the, senior management of listed companies. Secondly, by helping the industry think about stewardship more broadly, that is the whole value chain, not solely fund managers and public issuers that they invest in. So really sort of, it's, as Bruce mentioned before, other codes require signatories to, monitor and hold to account service providers. So, for example, the asset owners who are providing, could be providing their stewardship priorities to the fund managers that they delegate to. There's other entities that are all part of the value chain, so consultants, advisors, wealth managers, even the ESG and proxy voting advisors. So I think having a wide-reaching code would help provide guidance for and help cement stewardship over that entire investment value chain.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. I think the fact that the code would actually be there to provide the guidance might help answer this question from somebody, which I'm going to throw at you, Philip. It says, do you think we're too early in New Zealand's journey on this, as fund managers are only just getting to grips with proxy voting and engagement? The UK is already developing this, but they've been doing ESG for years.
Yeah, so I think, based on the sort of those surveys of those two broad groups, the fund managers who are part of that benchmark survey, and also the asset owners, that it is, these are examples. They're not across the whole spectrum, but you can see that it is broadening out already, and so in that sense, it's sort of perfect timing to bring in the code. Now, the UK had a first iteration and then a second iteration. So, potentially that's, that might be the way that it evolves here. But I certainly, I don't believe that it's too early, because I think there's a lot of appetite to really sort of develop in this area. And as we've sort of already, talked about, that in many cases, that people are sort of looking for some kind of guidance and helping something that sort of has common framework would help.
Yeah, I think the looking for guidance is a key aspect to and benefit of the code. As you know, Bruce, New Zealand is lagging behind comparable markets when it comes to Stewardship Code, and in fact most international markets have had a code for many years, and as Philip's mentioned, the Stewardship Code in the UK's had two attempts at it to ramp it up. But in your opinion, Bruce, in addition to the Korean code, which you helped develop, what have been two effective approaches to stewardship codes that you have seen globally?
Well, actually, it may be too early to say Stewardship Code implementation was successful in other countries as well. However, at least asset managers no longer simply do fundamental researches and buy and hold portfolios for their clients. Rather, they are now doing consistent engagement and proxy voting to improve corporate governance in other countries like UK, USA, even Japan, and some part of Korea as well. Even passive managers such as BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, they used to have an investment philosophy not to make any proxy voting 10 years ago. Nowadays, they have the biggest responsible investment team in which they are doing engagement and proxy voting for their clients. This is a big change. And most public pensions in Europe, it is mandatory for them to stick doing engagement and proxy voting. Equity fund managers with ESG strategy observed more than 2/3 of new fund flows over the past 4 years globally, which means Stewardship Code, ESG, and engagement, these things are now already becoming a global standard. For example, in UK, they revised Stewardship Code last year, which is in general reinforcing requirement. And European Union is now taking proactive steps for registration of these responsible investment requirements. But in case of UK Stewardship Code, they adopted apply and explain, not comply or explain. At the moment, most of the other countries' Stewardship Code is based on comply or explain, which is voluntary. However, in UK new Stewardship Code, they adopted apply and explain, which is stronger requirement. And also the second European Union Shareholder Rights Directive, which was effective as of 2019, they are requiring legal responsibility for engagement by asset managers and owners. At the moment, the International Organization of Securities Commission, IOSCO, is preparing regulatory approach to sustainability-related practices, such as reporting by asset managers, in order to minimize the greenwashing concern. In Japan, I think it is kind of unique. They adopted Stewardship Code 2014 when there was Abe Shue was the prime minister. They called it one of the major driver for Japan capital market reform. It's called Abenomics, and Stewardship Code was from top-down approach. So Abe himself was very supportive in terms of adopting Stewardship Code. So as a result, some argue that ROE of listed funds in Japan has been uptrend, and also Nikkei index, which was in the box for the past 20 years, around 10,000 level, but it's now 30,000 level. So meaning that Japanese corporate governance are improving so that the valuation of the market is getting higher. So we have seen many cases in Japan, like 7-Eleven, Nissan, Fana, Toshiba cases. So Japan's financial authority published a report last year before the revision of their Stewardship Code that the introduction of Stewardship Code in Japan has improved sustainability of Japanese economy. That's what they are arguing at the moment. But both UK and Japanese Stewardship Code are governed by regulatory agent, government agent, while Korea, Thailand, Taiwan, industry agents are governing Stewardship Code, where there are lots of criticism about introduction of Stewardship Code as a storm in a teacup, because in these market there are a lot of because it is voluntary code, they pretend to follow the code. However, real actual outcome is not enough to notice.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. I like the point you make, Bruce, about the UK code now adopting apply and explain instead of a comply and explain, which definitely requires more accountability from the fund managers. And I also like the Japanese approach, which was that top-down approach. And I think the clear leadership there is imperative to success for a code in New Zealand. I've just got a question here, which I'm actually going to throw at Susheela, I think, because of Susheela's international experience. So the question is, why do you think New Zealand is behind other parts of the world when it comes to stewardship and stewardship codes, but we're leading the way with our climate-related disclosure regime?
It's been an interesting observation that some of the places which have been fastest to implement stewardship codes are places where they've had crises, where the crises have made themselves very apparent. And for instance, the K review was a direct response to some of the things that happened during the global financial crisis. That's the prompt for the UK code development and a lot of the codes that happen around the world from there. The reality of engagement and proxy voting is that we are starting to talk about it from a sustainability and corporate governance perspective, but in reality, many asset managers do engagement all the time. It just happens not to be part of necessarily a sustainability conversation or a governance conversation, an ordinary conversation that they have with a company. And I've been part of some of these conversations over the years, observed some of these conversations over the years. It might be about what the capital allocation decision is that's coming, or, what the dividend is, who they think they're going to appoint as a successor to the next CEO, all of those kinds of things. So it's not necessarily that those conversations aren't happening. It's that we don't have a way of being accountable for the content of those conversations and the purpose that it's driving for. And that's the kind of thing that a good stewardship code should really seek to address, which is also why I think that there are certainly arguments to be made for, a heavier-handed set of expectations around what that content of the stewardship should be. But it also needs to accommodate a recognition that it's not the mechanisms that necessarily need primary attention. It's not necessarily the voting in the individual company meetings. It's the substance of what's being driven for by those participants. Bruce mentioned Vanguard and BlackRock, among others, and it's true that there's been a lot of change in their approach over the years. Vanguard in Australia was actually one of the founders of Regnan in 2006 because they recognised that their business model and the way that they invested meant that they were never going to be good at this in-house. They don't have relationships directly with companies. They wanted it done, and to be done well, they needed a third party to do it. And in that case, it was through the collective process that Regnan, collectivized. So I think it's a really interesting question as to whether New Zealand really is as bad at it as you think you are. I'm not sure that we necessarily have the data on that. I think what's probably true to say is that the accountability mechanisms that enable a beneficial owner, whether that happens to be a government pensions fund or an individual saver, to understand what is being done on their behalf aren't there. And they're some of the key things that a stewardship code would address.
Yeah, good answer, Susheela, because it leads very nicely into another question that we've had. And I do appreciate your point about the stewardship driving that accountability, which goes back to somebody's, the Latin, which is who's watching the watchers. And the question actually says, how do you think a code could work regarding disclosure of those engagement activities when a lot of New Zealand's engagement happens to be on a golf course or at a barbecue? New Zealand is a small place and business leaders and fund managers are often connected socially. For that one, I will probably ask Philip for his advice and guidance on that.
Yeah, so I mean, as noted before, this is, the transparency is definitely in an area that's ripe for improvement. And again, just sort of referring back to, what the industry is doing at the moment. The survey showed that over a quarter of investment managers don't actually report on corporate engagement at all. As the question alludes to, a lot of it is privately done. Investors, fund managers or asset owners should typically communicate, both the activities and outcomes of their stewardship. And that, has been interpreted in other countries to include the voting records, rationales for all the votes against management, engagements and outcomes. What are they setting out to achieve from the engagement? Also, collaborative memberships, which is obviously a growing area internationally. Conflicts of interest policy, Bruce touched on, and stewardship principles and governance. It's also, a key point around the transparency is that it's also quite valuable for the corporates as well to see what investors' priorities actually are, and how they're voting, because that's certainly something that a number of public companies have said that that they don't have full visibility over how their investors are actually voting and what their priorities are.
Yeah, I think those that priority through voting principles is definitely going to be a key benefit in my opinion. It's going to help a lot of investor relations people within corporates understand things and communicate the requirements of investors more clearly internally. I'm just looking at Jenny now, actually. Just in terms of unpacking Stewardship Code in the context of existing regulation, and from a legal perspective, we already have a number of financial services regulations. So what outcomes would a code help to deliver that existing legislation and codes do not? I know Susheela has touched on the accountability issue, but how do you see a code helping with that, Jenny?
Well, it depends a little bit on the code, but I think that there's two areas where I see this as being a really useful addition to the regulatory framework. And the first is the one that Susheela's already sort of talked about, where things like the HIH collapse identified a bit of a gap in our system, because our current rules are premised around protecting shareholder and investor financial interests, but they do really rely on the idea that shareholders and investors will take action to enforce and implement those rights and exercise the rights that they have. Whereas particularly, in sort of modern investing and financial services, ownership is very diffuse or intermediated or both. And so the expectations that the people who created the guts of our company and company law and financial services law decades ago had about how things would work don't really hold. So I think there's an obvious role there in terms of accountability, and that's also similar to the point Bruce was making about how we really need a stewardship code to mirror corporate governance codes. For one to work, we need the other to be watching. So I can see it fulfilling an important role there. And the other one is a little bit different, and that's around sustainability and environmental and social issues, because it seems to me that a stewardship code doesn't necessarily need to be tied up with those issues, but there's an obvious opportunity there. And again, our traditional, our existing rules and regulations on the whole have quite a narrow conception of shareholder and investor interests as being predominantly financial, and don't really take into account a kind of broader idea of interests as being more long-term, or interests as members of society and people who are also affected, whether as investors or just people, by the environmental and social impacts of the conduct of the companies they're investing in. So I can see, and we currently don't really have anything in our regulatory framework that really addresses that. So the stewardship code would certainly help to fill that gap.
Yeah, I think the focus on environmental and social positive outcomes is definitely one that I see as a key sort of outcome for a stewardship code. And definitely we don't want to create a compliance burden with the code. We actually do want to have a code that makes a positive difference. So Susheela, based on your experience, how should we design a code that helps achieve those positive outcomes for the environment and for our society and for our economy?
Fortunately, I've done a little bit of work on this for the Principles for Responsible Investment. It's embodied in a paper that they've published on stewardship, which embodies effectively their leading practice standard, called Active Ownership 2.0. And importantly, it emphasises three key parts of what stewardship that really makes a difference in the world would need to involve. And one of those is that it focuses on things that are happening in the real world, things that companies do in the real economy, not just corporate governance. So it takes the corporate governance as a mechanism for transmitting the intentions of the investor or the beneficiary through to the company. It's only a mechanism, it's not the end result. The second is that the goals that it should be transmitting to the companies should be the common goals that we all share. So things that are around the effective functioning of societies, a stable environment, such that enterprise can even continue. I mean, a lot of the kinds of things that the shorter term pressures, the intermediary pressures often transmit to companies are things that ultimately may be in tension with those common goals. And really that's the reason that we need something like the Stewardship Code or investment governance at all, to be able to kind of restrain that excessively short-term prioritisation being transmitted through the chain. So we have real-world outcomes, common goals, so not just those that are of interest to that individual company and its profitability. And the third element is not to neglect collaboration. And so where, like companies themselves, asset managers and others within the financial sector are often in competition with each other, and that often results in the kinds of stewardship activities that are primarily aimed at satisfying their own individual compliance requirement or impressing their own client base, when actually there's a lot to be gained and a lot of cost to be reduced through the collectivisation opportunities that exist across the sector. So they're the three elements. Active Ownership 2.0 is a very short paper and it's very easy to download from the PRI website. In fact, I'll put in a link into the chat for anybody who is interested. But they're the three key elements. I probably haven't spoken directly to what a code involves. This is what good stewardship involves. And so, what a good code would involve is something that pointed to the kind of good stewardship that needs to be done.
Yeah, I do like the Active Ownership 2.0. Susheela, I know you had a good hand in it and I can see that. So thank you. And I do recommend that as a read for people. And there's also a couple of other valuable articles that Susheela has written. So we'll put those up as well. Thank you very much for that. Just Bruce, following on from Susheela's point, in your experience, what other items should we consider here when it comes to designing and implementing a stewardship code in New Zealand?
Given the status quo of New Zealand capital market, it's small and not many companies are listed and not many big asset managers, things like that. I think the first important step is improving awareness of investing public. We need to educate them why Stewardship Code will be important in the future for sustainable growth. And participation by key investors and big asset managers like Kiwi Savers, Super Fund would be important so that we can have some kind of consensus in the beginning. On top of that, as Sheila mentioned, many asset managers have done engagement over the past years or so, but in fact, practical guidelines need to be given or provided, or standard engagement, things like that need to be shared by participants so that to minimize any misunderstanding would be very important. So I think simpler the better for New Zealand Stewardship Code. On top of that, we need to think about ownership structure, such as institutionalization ratio. I mean, New Zealand has lower institutionalization compared to US or Australia, and lower foreign investor participation. So these are the important factors before we design it. And also, like Korea or Thailand, they don't have it, but we better have proper level of enforcement so that participants need to stick to the core, to achieve a common goal in the longer term. I found the biggest hurdle for implementing Stewardship Code in Asia Pacific, countries like Japan, Korea, is one thing is cultural barrier, like Confucianism. And people do not want to challenge others. That's one thing. And the major problem was lack of experience of engagement and proxy voting. I think engagement and proxy voting, it doesn't have clear-cut solution. Each agenda could be solved a different way. So there is no clear-cut answer. So it is important to build up engagement know-how and proxy voting know-how in the longer term. So fostering expertise for engagement and proxy voting will take time. It's not gonna be done within a short period of time. New Zealand corporates and asset managers need to start step by step. We shouldn't be so aggressive in the beginning, I think.
Yeah, I think I like your advice, Bruce, that the simpler, the better. And I think awareness and education is a key enabler, as is practical guidance on how to do stewardship, not necessarily a stewardship code. And I know that would be music to Susheela's ears. But Jenny, just going back to sort of the more legal side of things, what do you see as some of the risks that introducing a code would or could create in New Zealand? And what do you see, what would be a heightened risk? Is there a potential for a heightened risk of greenwashing, for example?
Well, potentially. I think it very much depends on the design and nature of the code. So, the extent to which it's voluntary or not, the extent to which it is has oversight from a regulatory body or not, how prescriptive it is. I think these are all things which will influence whether it does potentially become a vehicle for greenwashing, which I think is a risk. So, there's obviously a risk that it becomes a nice box to tick, but doesn't actually add anything meaningful. So investors and provided with a false sense of reassurance, I guess, about how their investments are being managed that may not be reflected in the reality. And I guess there's other risks as well. So if it's depending on how it's drafted, if it's too open textured, it may just simply create a bit of uncertainty. And it may actually put asset managers in a slightly tricky position if they're not really sure what their obligations are. And equally, it needs to be very clear how it interacts with existing regulation. So although I think there's a good argument that a proper interpretation of the duties of asset managers would encompass taking the more broad, enlightened view of their clients' interests, there is potential for conflict. And I think Susheela mentioned, that there are examples where short-term financial interests may conflict with a sort of more open, longer-term view. So it does, I think, ideally, our regulatory framework would work holistically, and people would know where their duties lay in those sorts of situations without being torn between a voluntary code, which is aspirational in one direction, and a sort of a narrow rule on the other side, which might not accommodate that all that well. So there does need to be that integration, I think.
Yeah, I think the point that you've made there is really important in terms of avoiding greenwashing. The other thing is the avoiding not making it an additive point. So just on that, Philip, right-sizing a code in New Zealand is important for our small market. And as already been asked by one of the participants, the climate-related disclosure regime is hitting us, as well as the value for money requirements. So a lot of fund managers don't have a lot of spare capacity at the moment. So I'm keen to understand what your thoughts are on why they should be putting Stewardship Code onto their already busy agenda.
Yeah, sure. I mean, briefly, I mean, I agree there is a lot going on. But as I mentioned before, I think the industry is moving in this direction already, and a code would help guide that along. And I think it would also ultimately help with some of the other obligations, whether it's the climate-related disclosures, essentially by sort of making sure that disclosures are useful all the way through the chain, and not simply just about compliance. And also, the other thing that's obviously absorbing a lot of people's focus is around, value for money. But I think, effective stewardship is a great way to demonstrate added value for money. If you can demonstrate, competitive fees and a strong ESG process and stewardship, that's an appealing combination for a lot of New Zealanders.
Yeah, I agree. And then also to go back to your earlier point, there's the effective engagement and also the accountability aspect. So, Bruce, just in terms of that, who's watching the watchers, I know that stewardship codes internationally can be industry-led or regulator-led. What do you see as the benefits and drawbacks of those two approaches? And which approach have you found to be more effective?
I think small markets like New Zealand, regulator-led stewardship code would be better, more effective, because the evidence with watching in smaller markets in Asia Pacific, if industry-led stewardship code is adopted, people are simply ignoring it, and they don't know what to do. No consistency, clarity, and more controversial. So regulator-led stewardship code model could be better. And also in countries like Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, there had been a lot of proof, that listed firms are reluctant. And asset owners and managers are talking about cost of implementing stewardship code. And in case of Korea, we had to face political pressure as well. So industry-driven stewardship code has a lot of limitation, and it takes much more patience. And there are also free riding issues. Asset managers who doesn't do any stewardship code, they can benefit from the other asset managers who do engagement and proxy voting.
Yeah, true. I think that's a really valid point. But Jenny, just what's your perspective on the code, which is likely to be drafted by industry? What's your thinking on the role of the regulator here?
Well, like Bruce, I tend to think that a regulator managed and enforced code will have more impact because people will have to comply with it. But I think as well, it's important to think about the regulator's role as it's not simply a matter of regulators enforcing things through litigation. Regulators do generally have a much wider role in terms of issuing guidance, monitoring the market, helping with education. I think whatever form the code takes, it really needs some resourcing around it for those sorts of aspects to be effective. And if it's not going to be done by a regulator, then you do need to have some industry body that is actually adequately resourced and mandated to do that. And I think having it done by a regulator just makes it, gives it a greater degree of independence and stability potentially. But you do also need to make sure the regulator themselves are actually funded and resourced to do it, because I know, the Financial Markets Authority is getting a lot of new responsibility, including sort of managing the TCFD, climate-related financial disclosure. So there's a risk of overburdening our regulators, but provided that they get resources, I think that would be the optimum approach.
Yeah. Just a note to participants, if you would like to put any further Q&A into the Q&A function or the chat function, now is your chance. We have 7 beautiful minutes left, so don't be shy and put your questions through the Q&A as you deem appropriate. But just a few sort of wrapping up questions before we do wrap up. I'd be interested in your 2 takeaways for the audience to think about, both in their approaches to stewardship at the moment and also how you would see a code helping improve those approaches. So let's start with Susheela for that one.
I think the first thing is to realise that stewardship is likely to be happening already. It might not be good stewardship, and it might not be the stewardship for the outcomes that we all collectively want and need, but it's likely to be happening. And that occurs every time that somebody who holds the ownership rights in a company, whether for a beneficiary or in their own interest, wields those rights, wields a vote, has a conversation with a company director, whether it's on the golf course or anywhere else. Anytime you're exercising that influence, that is a kind of stewardship. So I think one of the really interesting questions is to ask, to what end are you putting that influence that you already have? Then probably the second takeaway is to understand what those goals should be and what the goals are that, the New Zealand financial community and the regulators and the community at large need those goals to be. And to recognise that there are lots and lots of different ways of getting there. So I've mentioned a couple of times collaboration and collectivisation. I've heard, and we heard it in Australia and lots of other jurisdictions too, about constraints on resourcing and the reality that it's not just a capacity gap, it's often a capability gap. You don't expect a quantitative manager, for example, to be able to have detailed conversations about fundamentals with a company director. It may be completely wasteful for them to be resourcing that directly. There are lots of opportunities when you're beginning something new to collectivise and collaborate, especially as these issues that we are focused on taking carriage of are largely collective, commons type challenges. They're pre-competitive. There shouldn't be a need to be competitive about stewardship.
I think the key success for New Zealand is that collaboration, as Philip highlighted. I think the market would really benefit, and a good example of that is the Climate Action 100, which operates internationally, but bringing that to New Zealand, or something where you have that collective approach, I think is of real benefit to the session. We don't have any further Q&A from our lovely audience, I'm afraid, team. So we haven't achieved our 5-question target, so never mind. Just before we do sign off, I did want to offer thanks to everyone. Many thanks for your questions and for your attention. I know it is hard to focus when things are online. But before we do sign off, I did want to draw your attention to tomorrow's sessions. The breakfast sessions, which start at 8 a.m, include a session on customer data to deliver moments that matter. So that sounds very intriguing. A session on whether COVID has fundamentally changed life insurance sector. And for those involved in investment and KiwiSaver, there's also a session looking at the future of fund managers. So that one there is particularly interesting. The sponsors for those breakout sessions include Winter and Rudd Watts, Strategy Group and Guardian Trust. And once again, thanks to the sponsors for you making this happen. But last but not least, I wanted to offer my esteemed thanks to our panellists. Their international and domestic experience, along with their pragmatic approach to New Zealand market, has been a highlight to me. So thank you for all of your time and your advice and guidance. And you've brought real value to the conversation, so thank you. We do have a message here from a participant. Thank you to all the panellists. Your discussion was so complete that I didn't have any questions. So thank you very much.